everyone. Do you know that 900 years ago, the skyline of the city of Bologna, Italy, was dominated by medieval skyscrapers? High and slender towers of stone and brick that the wealthy families of the city competed to build. Tonight, we're going to continue our journey to the Middle Ages with a new wonder to explore, these towers of Bologna. They may not be as famous as other monuments from the medieval period, but they are intriguing, and they open a window on a long-gone era, the rise of rich and powerful cities in northern Italy during the Middle Ages, the resurgence of trade, the first universities, the University of Bologna, that still exists, is considered the oldest university in continuous operation in the world. It started more than 900 years ago. So, what was Bologna like so many generations ago? Why did these medieval towers suddenly appear in this city specifically? And what remains of them today? This is what we are going to find out tonight. Bologna today is still an important city, with a metropolitan area that is home to about 1 million people. And this is an old city. It has been an important urban center since antiquity. It was originally Etruscan. The Etruscan civilization consisted of a federation of city-states in the north and center of Italy, dominated by the Etruscan people. They had their own original culture, and the entire Etruscan area was absorbed by the Roman Republic and Romanized in the second half of the first millennium BC. It didn't go without trouble, because in the 5th and 4th centuries BC, the north of Italy was dominated by the Celts, by Gaulish tribes that regularly went to war with Rome. And for some time, the site of Bologna was occupied by a tribe of Gauls. But once Italy was completely controlled by Rome, the city enjoyed a long period of peace that helped its development. Like many Italian cities, its fortune reversed when the empire weakened, and when barbarian invasions threatened the north of Italy. Germanic tribes like the Goths, also the Huns. So Bologna was sacked several times in the last 2 centuries of the Western Roman Empire, and it had to be rebuilt. We lack records about this period of several centuries between the last decades of the Roman Empire and the 8th-9th centuries AD. But it is likely that Bologna during this period was only the shadow of what it had been as a Roman city. In the 8th century AD, it fell to another Germanic people, the Lombards, who invaded northern Italy. The region of Lombardy, the most populated Italian region, still bears their name. At the time, Bologna was near the southern frontier of the kingdom of the Lombards. But this kingdom didn't last long. On request of the Pope in Rome, the Emperor Charlemagne invaded it and annexed the north of Italy to his kingdom. Bologna now found itself, by the end of the 8th century, on the southern frontier of Charlemagne's empire, which itself would break down later. But it would not affect Bologna much. The city started to prosper again. this time as a march of the Carolingian Empire, of Charlemagne's empire. In the context of the Middle Ages, a march or a mark was the term used to name a borderland. The Carolingians gave quite a lot of independence to their faraway territories. They had a heartland in the west of Germany, north of France, Belgium and the Netherlands that was well controlled under a tight administration for the time. But the rest of the empire around that was like a halo, with regions that had pledged allegiance but were increasingly more independent as they were distant from the center. And Bologna was in that case, a fairly autonomous city that could now prosper thanks to peace, thanks to its presence in a fertile and temperate region, and also the revival of trade in Italy and beyond the Alps towards northern and western Europe. I will elaborate more on this in an upcoming episode, in which I will tell you about medieval Venice and St. Mark's Basilica. But the important thing here is that Bologna rose to become one of the largest cities in Italy and Europe along the 10th, 11th, 12th and 13th centuries. It was one of the large medieval urban centers of Europe, alongside Venice, Paris, Bruges, London, Milan or Genoa. Cities like Milan, Venice, Bologna, Genoa, and to these we could add Verona or Florence. That is a lot of large medieval cities in Italy. This is not a coincidence. Northern Italy emerged as a wealthy region in the second half of the Middle Ages, starting in the 10th and 11th centuries. And this prosperity of Bologna that led to the tower building frenzy we're going to discuss tonight is linked to this phenomenon. So why did Northern Italy suddenly prosper like this? For several reasons. First, because it had a legacy. More than other regions of the Roman Empire, it had infrastructures like roads, ports, markets or aqueducts, and large urban centers. Of course, all of this had been ruined and fallen into disrepair following the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. But it is easier to repair a road than create it from scratch. It is easier to cultivate plains that have already been cleared of their forests, and so on. So this legacy of the Roman Empire provided a base for Italian cities to be reborn. A second set of factors were geographic and climatic elements. The plain of the Po River in the north of Italy is fertile with a rather mild climate that made agriculture productive and helped sustain a large population. But this is not all. Yet another major factor is the development of trade to, from and within northern Italy along the Middle Ages. Several maritime republics emerged, the most famous being obviously Venice, but Genoa was also very important, and there were lesser merchant republics like Pisa. Culturally, all these small states in the north of Italy were very forward-looking and interested in serving as trade hubs for the rest of Christendom. They had preserved connections to the east, to the Eastern Roman Empire, to Byzantium. So leveraging these, their merchants adventured to the east, in the Eastern Mediterranean or the Black Sea. They traded with ports that were at the end of the Silk Road and the Spice Road. Part of their wealth was based on bringing exotic goods. textiles like silk, spices, precious materials like jade, lapis lazuli, ivory, gems like diamonds that at the time essentially came from India because American and African diamond mines were unknown, and so on. And these goods would be sold at a high margin to the rest of Europe. They crossed the Alps and went on rivers and roads to regions where they were sought after, where they were in high demand, like Germany, around the Baltic Sea, northern France, Flanders and the Netherlands, the south of England, Catalonia. So the north of Italy became the main trade hub of Europe, which brought it significant wealth too, and helped its development. Because this trade also had positive consequences, positive externalities, as economists would say. With higher revenues and the search for products to sell abroad on these international trade routes, appeared a new demand for manufactured goods and even luxury goods. Fine clothes, glass, jewelry and silverware. Part of the tradition and know-how for fine crafts and luxury goods in the north of Italy that continues to this day with well-known brands has its roots in this historical context. It is like in France. These things can take centuries to form and are the product of a specific historical set of conditions. So this northern Italian trade stimulated a medieval industry that was obviously very different from the kind of manufacturing that appeared since the Industrial Revolution. There were no factories or big shops. Instead, there were smaller shops, guilds or artisans, a cottage industry, that is to say, people receiving supplies and producing at home. So, for this reason too, the north of Italy and Bologna benefited from a more developed and complex economy, something that only had an equivalent maybe in Flanders in the last centuries of the Middle Ages. And these evolutions with more trade and crafts started at a time when much of Europe still had a much more basic and survival-oriented economy. And finally, last but not least, in the last decades of the Middle Ages, an early financial industry appeared with proto-banks that served to fund trade operations. For example, they funded cargoes to arm commercial ships, or they kept savings. Examples of this include the oldest bank still in operation in the world, which appeared in the late 15th century in the city of Siena, the Bank Monte dei Paschi di Siena, which still exists today. Another sign of this trade and financial expansion is the invention of double-entry bookkeeping, something well known by accountants. Double-entry bookkeeping is the practice to record every operation on two sides, debit and credit, which has become a basic practice of accounting. All these things were invented or refined in medieval northern Italy, in a region dotted by large cities like Venice, Genoa, Milan, Florence and Bologna. The accumulation of wealth, the forward-looking mindset, the availability of resources to invest in research, in architecture and art. All of this is credited to have kick-started the Renaissance, starting in the years 1400 in Italy, the Quattrocento, and spreading to the rest of Europe a few decades later. So genuinely, the history of the world took a turn in the late Middle Ages in northern Italy, as a result of a process that had started centuries earlier. And one last remark before we return to Bologna is that this is also why most historians consider unfair the image of backwardness or stagnation that is often associated with the Middle Ages. This was just not true. The medieval period was one of slow growth, yes, and there were setbacks caused by wars or epidemics that sometimes sent back entire regions a century or two, economically and demographically. But beyond these shocks, these were centuries of reurbanization, of slow technical progress and demographic growth, of gains of cultivable land on the forests that previously covered much of Europe, of accumulation of wealth and transformation of mindsets that would later allow Western Europe to project itself and create a technical advance for itself, compared with the rest of the world, to a level that had never been seen before in world history. But all of this was just to give you context for the success of Bologna as a medieval city. And it is in this context that the towers began to rise. How many towers, by the way? It is hard to have an exact number, because a majority of them were demolished starting in the Middle Ages to avoid collapse or take back the building materials. Modern historians estimate the number of towers to about 80 to 100, with the highest ones approaching 100 meters in height, more than 300 feet. In average, they would have been 60 meters high, or about 200 feet. For the time, and considering how thin they were, these heights were vertiginous. The towers must have caused to the population the same feeling we may have looking at these very slender and high towers that have appeared in Manhattan in the past 15 or 20 years. Their proportions were very unusual, and they were thought out with foundations that went 5 to 10 meters deep, that is to say the equivalent to 2 to 4 stories underground. Each tower had a square cross-section, and the base was typically made of stone, the most durable and strongest material available. But how to erect such a high tower when the walls are going to be very heavy and without a metal structure like in modern skyscrapers? By using a method that the Romans had already used to make domes. As the structure was raised, the walls were made successively thinner and thinner to limit their weight. The masonry was similar to what was done at the time for fortified walls, like in castles or the walls that surrounded cities. There were an inner wall, an outer wall, and in between there was a void, a gap, that would be filled with stones and mortar. So when the mortar had dried, it stuck together the inner and outer walls and made these structures fairly strong. Also, in case the outer wall would collapse due to aging or a projectile hitting it, it generally did not compromise the entire wall, because the intermediate section, the layer of mortar and rubble, would resist. So the towers would be built by adding successive stories, which was slow, because the mortar had to dry before more wall was added above it, and also expensive, because stones and bricks were not the go-to building materials at the time. Houses were still made of wood or adobe. Stone was the material for palaces, fortresses, or religious buildings. A practice that spread in Italian cities at the time was to build stone houses for affluent families, traders, guildmasters, high officials, aristocrats, bankers. But that option remained very high-end at the time. So it is estimated that an average tower of 60 meters or 200 feet would take 3 to 10 years of work. In the 12th to 13th centuries, we have to imagine the skyline of Bologna with its existing towers, dozens of them, and several more in construction, surrounded with scaffoldings. Some holes were left in the outer walls to support scaffoldings or to be able to add coverings later. It seems the number of towers peaked in the 13th century, the years 1200. After that, they were either demolished or collapsed, to the point that today only 20 towers remain. But out of these 20, the majority have been shortened to a few floors, and they no longer rise above the other buildings. Only 2 towers, called the 2 Towers of Bologna, in the center of the city, still give an idea of what these towers were like. With the higher of these 2 towers, the Asinelli Tower, standing at 97 meters tall, more than 300 feet. And there is also a shorter one at its side, the Garisenda Tower, at 47 meters. I have stood at their feet, and it is hard not to feel a bit of vertigo, because they feel abnormally high for medieval structures, and on top of that they lean slightly, like the Tower of Pisa, an effect of the foundations sinking unevenly due to the structure of the soil under them. What was the inside of the towers like? We don't know for all towers, but it seems that they were fairly hollow, with only stairs for people to climb up. Stairs built around a central void. The lower floors were probably inhabited and served as houses for the owners or their people. When we speak of a house in the Middle Ages, figuratively, a house was a very expanded family that included way more than the modern nuclear family. There were also surviving ancestors living under the same roof, and all the employees that gravitated around the family, some of them bound to it on several generations. At the time in the 12th century, when the towers were built, serfdom was also widespread in Italy, and landowners also had this workforce. Even though this is hard to measure, it is believed that serfdom and the free labor that it gave to landowners was also a factor that made the building of these towers possible. But this leaves a question open. Why? Why the need to build these structures? Space to live was not really lacking. The towers were expensive. They don't seem to have had any obvious practical use. So what was the point? A first explanation can probably be found in the dangers of life at the time. I told you that northern Italy was relatively prosperous, but there were still wars regularly between the cities that were independent, and Bologna was one of the regional powers at the time. And you never knew how a war could turn out. When a city was taken, it would be sacked, and its inhabitants left to the goodwill of the victors. Bologna had its armies and walls that protected it. But wealthy families may well have wanted to have another layer of security. by having their own little fortress in town. A refuge that was even more useful because the threat could also come from within the city. Cities were prone to rioting, and feuds between families could turn to violence. Another misconception about the Middle Ages, because it lasted for centuries and happened a long time ago, is to downplay or ignore social conflicts that arose from social transformation or power games between institutions or social groups. We tend to focus on wars between kingdoms, expeditions like the Crusades, or raids and invasions like the Vikings or later the Mongols. But a lot of tension and conflicts also happened within medieval societies, around religion, abuses, or the rights of institutions and people. One such religious and political conflict that led to violence at the turn of the 12th century is called the investiture controversy. I mention it because it happened just as the first towers began to rise in Bologna, and it is believed that it could have been a trigger. Investiture controversy, what does it mean? It was a conflict of influence between the Church and several European monarchs about who should choose bishops and other high dignitaries of the Church, like abbots, for example. In theory, the way medieval societies saw the sharing of authority was that the popes, the Church, was responsible for everything sacred and spiritual, whereas the secular power was in the hands of lords and kings. But this did not really eliminate rivalries or even conflicts. The Church was an international organization, at the scale of Christendom, or at least at the scale of Roman Catholic Europe, that recognized the Roman popes after the schism with the Orthodox in the East. We were still several centuries before the Protestant Reformation. So this international grid of bishoprics and parishes was superimposed on many different states, mostly kingdoms, but also republics or free cities that themselves could be part of larger confederations like the Holy Roman Empire, centered on Germany, the north of Italy, and the Low Countries, a remain of Charlemagne's empire, without the Kingdom of France that was going its own way. The problem was that in real life, this line of separation between the secular and the religious was not always that obvious, because the Church was also an institution interwoven with society, and the popes were also heads of state. So concretely, when there was a war between two kings, and the Pope was aligned with one of them, for the king who had the Pope against him, it meant the entire clergy within his own frontiers could become very suspicious. What if suddenly the tight network of priests started attacking the figure of the king every Sunday in front of the faithfuls? This created constant conflicts of loyalty. And the popes were not just religious authorities, they were heads of state themselves, with their own possessions in central Italy. In the Middle Ages, the popes were not heads of a tiny state like the Vatican, like today, which in practice doesn't really matter as a state. It has no secular power, no army or weight beyond the authority of the Pope himself. But back then, the popes had large possessions that formed the papal state. And this papal state was also a regional power, a military power, with its political interests, its diplomacy, and of course the constant temptations to use the Pope's religious authority to further the interest of the Papal States themselves. This tension went on for the entire Middle Ages and beyond. Multiple kings were excommunicated by the popes for not complying with the church's orders, and the Papal State was invaded several times by sovereigns. To a large extent, the King of France forcing the popes to move closer to his lands in Avignon, or later the creation of the Anglican Church in England by King Henry VIII. All of these political conflicts, these measures, derived from the rivalry between the popes and Christian sovereigns, who did not intend to tolerate an external power in Rome playing against their interests, or undermining their control on their own kingdoms. So this is what the investiture controversy was about. Who would get to choose and install bishops across European kingdoms? Nowadays, obviously, this is no longer an issue. The Church decides, but countries with a Catholic tradition are unbothered, because the Church is no longer a state like before, and also the bishops don't really have that much influence on society anymore. And we are also in modern, more pluralistic societies in which the freedom of speech of a bishop is not seen as a threat against the state, even if what he says annoys the current government. There is more acceptance of pluralism, freedom of conscience, and also the Church has way less influence on society than it had a few centuries ago, so it is manageable by secular powers. But 800 years ago, the stakes were higher, and both the popes and the kings wanted to choose the bishops so that they would control them. This rivalry turned into a full conflict that lasted for about 50 years. It was not a complete war, but this controversy crossed society, especially in the regions that belonged to the Holy Roman Empire, and people would take sides either with the popes or the secular sovereigns. Occasionally, this would lead to sporadic violence between the two sides. Bologna was independent, but it was part of the Holy Roman Empire. It was on its southern frontier, and as such it was involved. Some families supported extended powers for the Holy Roman Emperor, who was at the heart of this conflict because he wanted more influence on the choice of bishops across his lands. Other families sided with the popes, who at the time tried to reinforce their secular influence. We were in the late 11th century and early 12th century. The Crusades to the Levant were still very active. The popes were rather interventionist and had this dream of a more unified Christendom. But this period also had sudden bursts of social violence. Violence against the Jews, violence against any group that could be perceived as heretical. And it could well have been all this undercurrent of violence that pushed families in Bologna to start building the towers. Still, this may explain the beginning of the phenomenon, but it doesn't explain the height of the towers. And here it seems the only explanation is the competition between families. Along the 12th century, towers became symbols. They became way more than homes or private fortresses. They turned into symbols of a family's wealth and influence. It would have been embarrassing to have one of the smaller towers for an ambitious family, so they felt compelled to build higher, or at least as high, as their neighbors. It became a mechanism of social distinction. They were keeping up with the Jones, basically. And this was certainly the main reason for the spectacular heights reached by the towers. that no other function than one of representation justified. In summary, they were about showing off. As the 13th century advanced, some towers were demolished, and it seems others collapsed, which is not surprising given how daring they were. The towers crazed past, and the remaining towers became obsolete. They were repurposed as prisons, shops and stores, or sometimes as cheap housing. But as they sometimes looked dangerously fragile, more and more were demolished or shortened along the centuries. The last demolitions taking place in the early 20th century. Only the two surviving towers now remind of a time when Bologna looked like a kind of medieval Manhattan, with its dozens of skyscrapers. We have reached the end of our story for tonight. I'll be back soon with a new one, and in the meantime you may close your eyes, let go, and fall asleep, or pick another story from my library if you don't feel sleepy yet. Sleep well, sweet dreams, au revoir.